I remember that weekend like it was yesterday. I had been planning a solo retreat to clear my head after months of stress at work. A friend had recommended a remote cabin deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. They said it was perfect for solitude. It sounded ideal at the time, just me, nature, and the quiet. The drive up was uneventful. The road twisted and turned through thick forests, the kind where sunlight barely makes it through the canopy. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked as advertised, rustic but sturdy, with a small porch out front and a stone chimney. There was no electricity or running water, but I had come prepared with plenty of supplies, including a portable solar charger, a lantern, and a large jug of water. The first evening was peaceful. I settled in quickly, unpacked my things, and lit a fire in the old stone fireplace. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and smoke, and as the sun dipped below the trees, the woods grew dark and quiet. I sat on the porch for a while, sipping tea and listening to the sounds of the forest. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl, but otherwise, it was silent. The first strange thing happened the next morning. I woke up early, just as the sun was rising. Stepping outside, I noticed something odd. Around the cabin, the ground was covered in a fine layer of dirt and pine needles, but there were fresh footprints leading from the woods to the porch. They weren't mine. These were larger and deeper, as if made by someone much heavier than me. They stopped just a few feet from the front door and then disappeared. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, so I brushed it off. Maybe a hiker had wandered by, or perhaps an animal had made the tracks, though they looked distinctly human. I spent the rest of the morning exploring the area around the cabin, venturing a short distance into the woods. The forest was dense, and it was easy to lose my bearings, so I made sure to keep the cabin within sight. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't anything concrete, just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. By midday, I was back at the cabin. I made a simple lunch and spent the afternoon reading. The sense of unease from earlier had mostly faded, but I still felt a little on edge. To distract myself, I decided to chop some firewood. The rhythmic motion was calming, and the sound of the axe splitting logs echoed through the trees. That night, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, I was woken by a noise outside. It was faint at first, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the porch. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound stopped, leaving only the silence of the forest. Telling myself it was probably an animal, I tried to go back to sleep, but a few minutes later, the noise started again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch. Nothing. The porch was empty. I shone the light around the yard, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Still, the sound continued, now seeming to come from the back of the cabin. Summoning my courage, I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The cold night air bit at my skin as I circled the cabin. At the back, I found what had been making the noise. A large branch, jagged and broken, lying on the ground. It looked as if it had been dragged there deliberately, but by what, I couldn't say. I pushed it aside and returned to the cabin, bolting the door behind me. The next day, I decided to check the area more thoroughly. I found more footprints in the dirt, similar to the ones I'd seen before, but now they circled the cabin. They were erratic, crisscrossing, and doubling back on themselves. I followed one set into the woods, but they disappeared after a few yards. It was unsettling, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe someone else was camping nearby, though I hadn't seen or heard any signs of other people. I spent most of that day inside, keeping the fire going and trying to focus on my book. As night fell, I felt a growing sense of dread. I double-checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Despite my precautions, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. The final night was the worst. I had just started to drift off when a loud banging jolted me awake. It was coming from the front door, heavy and insistent, as if someone were trying to break it down. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and a knife from the kitchen. The banging stopped abruptly, and silence fell again. I waited, listening intently. Then I heard it. The sound of breathing, low and guttural, just outside the door. I froze, gripping the knife tightly. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity before fading away. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with the knife in my lap, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed my things as quickly as I could. As I loaded the car, I found one last chilling detail. On the porch, etched into the wood with what looked like a knife, was a single word: leave. I didn't need any more convincing. I drove away from that cabin and never looked back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I've never felt the same about being alone in the woods. Some places are better left undisturbed. I had been planning a solo getaway for weeks, needing a break from the relentless pace of city life. A small cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. It wasn't anything fancy, just a rustic place I found on a rental site. The pictures showed a modest wooden cabin nestled between tall pines, with a small porch and a view of a lake. It was remote, and that's exactly what I wanted: silence and solitude. The drive out there was uneventful but long. I left early in the morning, the city's noise fading behind me as I ventured deeper into the countryside. The roads became narrower, winding through forests that seemed to stretch forever. My phone lost signal about an hour before I arrived, which I expected. The isolation was part of the charm, though I did feel a slight unease as the road turned to gravel and the trees grew thicker. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. It stood alone, surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides and a clear view of the lake on the 4th. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I parked my car a few feet from the porch and unloaded my bags. The silence was almost overwhelming. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a small living area with a worn couch and a wood-burning stove, a kitchenette with basic appliances, and a single bedroom with a queen-size bed. The bathroom was tiny but functional. I noticed the windows had thick curtains, which seemed odd given the lack of nearby neighbors, but I didn't think much of it. After unpacking, I made myself a quick meal and stepped onto the porch to take in the view. The lake was still, its surface reflecting the gray sky. I sat on a wooden chair and watched as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I realized I wasn't used to this level of quiet. Back home, there was always some background noise, even at night. Here, the silence felt heavy, pressing against my ears. That first night, I slept uneasily. The bed was comfortable enough, but every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wooden beams, seemed amplified in the stillness. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I peered through the curtains, there was nothing but darkness. I told myself it was just animals. After all, this was their territory. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. There was a narrow trail that wound through the woods, and I followed it for a couple of miles. The trees were tall and close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. I came across a few animal tracks, but no signs of other people. The solitude was starting to feel less like a blessing and more like a weight. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it before leaving, My stomach tightened as I stepped inside, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place. My bags were untouched, and the cabin was just as I had left it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent the afternoon trying to relax, reading a book and sitting by the lake. But my mind kept wandering back to the door. Had I really left it open? Or was someone else out here? I told myself I was being paranoid. This was a secluded spot, miles from the nearest town. Who would come all the way out here? That night, I locked the door and checked it twice before going to bed. I even propped a chair against it just in case. Sleep came in fits and starts. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. It wasn't a creak or a groan this time. It was a deliberate noise, like something tapping against the window. My heart raced as I lay there, listening. Top, top, top. It was slow and steady, coming from the living room. I forced myself to get up, every nerve in my body screaming to stay put. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept into the living room. The tapping stopped as soon as I entered. I shone the light on the window, but there was nothing there, just the reflection of the room. My hands were shaking as I checked the lock. It was secure. Trying to calm myself, I told myself it was probably a branch or a bird. Still, I couldn't bring myself to go back to sleep. I sat on the couch, flashlight in hand, and waited for morning. The next day, I decided to cut my trip short. The peace and quiet I had craved were gone, replaced by a constant sense of unease. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. I popped the hood, hoping it was something simple, but I didn't have the tools or knowledge to fix it. I was stranded. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but every little noise set me on edge. By late afternoon, I decided to hike back to the main road. It was a few miles, but I figured I could flag down a passing car or find a house with a phone. I packed a bag with some water and a flashlight and set off. The woods felt different this time. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and the trees began to look the same, making it hard to tell if I was going the right way. As the sun set, I realized I wasn't going to make it to the road before dark. I cursed myself for leaving so late. My flashlight's beam cut through the growing darkness, but it felt like a tiny island of light in an ocean of black. The sounds of the forest grew louder, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. My imagination ran wild, conjuring images of animals or worse, someone following me. Then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the flashlight's range. It was standing still, partially obscured by the trees. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, the light trembling in my hand. I called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. Summoning every ounce of courage, I took a step forward, shining the light directly at it. It was a tree, just a tree, its gnarled branches forming a vaguely human shape. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I quickened my pace, practically jogging down the trail. When I finally saw the cabin's lights through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the couch. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the day. I told myself I'd hike out first thing in the morning, when it was light. I'd figure out the car later. But that night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. My mouth went dry as I lay there, listening. Whoever it was stopped at the front door. Then a soft knock. I didn't move. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The knock came again, louder this time. Then silence. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreat, fading into the night. I didn't sleep after that. When dawn broke, I grabbed my bag and left the cabin without looking back. The trail to the main road felt endless, but I kept going, driven by pure adrenaline. When I finally reached the road, I flagged down a passing truck. The driver, an older man, gave me a ride to the nearest town. I didn't tell him everything, just that my car had broken down and I needed help. Later, when I returned with a mechanic, the cabin felt different. The door was open, and inside, the chair I had propped against it was knocked over. Nothing else seemed disturbed, but the sight chilled me to the bone. The mechanic fixed my car, and I left without a word. I never found out who or what had been outside that night. Maybe it was a drifter, maybe a prankster, or maybe just my imagination running wild. But one thing is certain. I won't be going back to that cabin or any cabin anytime soon. It started as a simple idea for a peaceful getaway. Life had been overwhelming for months, and I felt like I needed to step away from the noise of the city. The stress of work, the constant emails, the endless calls, they all weighed on me. A quiet cabin in the woods sounded perfect. A colleague mentioned knowing someone who rented out an old cabin about 2 hours from the city. It wasn't listed anywhere online, but it was supposed to be serene and secluded. Exactly what I was looking for. The drive out was uneventful. The highway stretched into smaller roads that eventually turned into a single gravel lane cutting through dense forest. The air changed as I got closer, smelling of pine and damp earth. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly how I had imagined. Small, weathered wood, a slanted roof, and a wraparound porch. The place was surrounded by tall trees, their canopies almost blocking out the sky. There was a small clearing in front with a fire pit, and beyond that, nothing but woods. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A single room with a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a bed tucked into the corner. A small bathroom was attached, with just enough space for a shower and toilet. The windows were large, letting in the natural light and offering views of the forest. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and my phone barely had a signal. That was fine by me. I wanted to disconnect. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked my things, cooked a simple dinner, and spent the evening reading a book I'd been meaning to start. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. By nightfall, the forest was completely silent. I hadn't realized how much noise I was used to until I was surrounded by such stillness. It was unnerving at first, but I told myself it was part of the charm. The second day, I decided to explore the area. There was a faint trail that led deeper into the woods, and I followed it for a while. The trees here were massive, their trunks thick with age. The air was cool and damp, and sunlight filtered through the leaves in patches. After walking for about an hour, I stumbled upon a small creek. The water was crystal clear, and I spent some time sitting by it, enjoying the peace. It felt good to be away from everything, to have no responsibilities for a little while. On my way back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. About 20 feet off the trail, there was a pile of rocks stacked in a cone shape. It was deliberate, not something nature had done. Curious, I walked closer. The rocks were smooth, some covered in moss, and they were stacked carefully. It reminded me of cairns, the stone markers hikers sometimes leave, but this one felt different. I couldn't explain why, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. Shrugging it off, I made my way back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. The stillness of the forest, which had felt calming the day before, now felt oppressive. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, made me tense. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. But there was something else, a nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I eventually drifted off, but my sleep was restless. The next morning, I found something strange near the cabin. About 10 feet from the porch, there was a single shoe. It was an old, worn-out sneaker, muddy and frayed. It definitely wasn't mine, and I hadn't seen it the day before. I looked around, trying to figure out where it might have come from, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone else. It didn't make sense. I left the shoe where it was and tried to push it out of my mind. I spent the day close to the cabin, not feeling up to exploring again. I chopped some firewood, made lunch, and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the shoe and the strange pile of rocks. By evening, I was on edge. The peaceful retreat I'd envisioned was quickly turning into something else. That night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it, faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind. It was a tapping sound, like something lightly hitting the side of the cabin. Top, top, top. I froze, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch or an animal, but it didn't stop. The taps were deliberate, spaced out evenly. I sat up, straining to hear more. The tapping moved, now coming from the window nearest the bed. I didn't dare look. The sound continued for what felt like an eternity before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep that night, keeping the flashlight clutched in my hand until the first light of dawn. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed my things quickly, tossing them into my bag without much care. As I stepped onto the porch, I froze. The shoe was gone. In its place was another pile of rocks, smaller than the one I'd seen on the trail, but just as deliberate. My hands trembled as I loaded my bag into the car. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. Something moved in the window. It was quick, just a shadow, but it was enough to make me floor the gas. The gravel sprayed as I sped down the lane, not stopping until I was back on the main road. It's been weeks since I left that cabin, but I can't stop thinking about it. The shoe, the rocks, the tapping, none of it makes sense. I told a few people about my experience, but no one has any answers. I've tried to put it behind me, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that tapping sound again. Top, top, top. And I wonder if I ever really left that place behind. I've always been someone who enjoyed solitude. There's something calming about being away from the noise of the world, surrounded by nature. That's why I decided to rent a remote cabin deep in the woods for a week. I wanted to unplug, to disconnect from work emails and social media, and just exist for a while. The idea was to spend the days hiking and the nights reading by the fire. It was supposed to be perfect. The cabin was advertised as off the grid, and it certainly lived up to that description. After driving for hours through increasingly narrow and rough dirt roads, I arrived at the place. It was small but cozy, with weathered wooden walls and a tin roof. The porch faced a dense forest, and there wasn't another house or cabin in sight. The nearest town was about an hour's drive away, and my cell phone had no signal long before I reached the cabin. That didn't bother me. It was what I wanted. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished. There was a small kitchen with an old stove and a single sink, a living room with a worn-out couch and a wood-burning stove, and a bedroom with a creaky twin bed. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 feet from the back door. It felt rustic and authentic, exactly what I'd imagined. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. I spent hours hiking the nearby trails, admiring the towering pines and the occasional glimpses of wildlife. I saw deer, squirrels, and even a fox. The air was crisp and cool, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. At night, I'd sit by the fire, listening to the crackling wood and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. On the third day, I decided to explore further into the woods. I packed a small backpack with water, a snack, and a flashlight, just in case I ended up staying out longer than planned. I didn't take a map because I figured I'd stay close enough to find my way back easily. The trails were unmarked, but I had a good sense of direction and wasn't too worried. As I walked, the forest grew denser. The trees were taller, their branches intertwined to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The ground was covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves, muffling my footsteps. It was beautiful but slightly eerie. There was a stillness to the air, as if the forest were holding its breath. After about an hour of hiking, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A clearing with the remnants of an old campsite. There was a rusted-out metal frame that might have been part of a cot, a collapsed tent, and a long-dead fire pit surrounded by blackened stones. It looked like no one had been there for years. Curious, I poked around, kicking at the debris. I found a moldy old backpack and, inside it, a few faded photographs of a man and a woman smiling at the camera. There was no note or anything to indicate who they were or what had happened. The whole scene felt odd, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. I didn't linger. Something about the campsite unsettled me, and I decided to head back to the cabin. But as I retraced my steps, I started to feel uneasy. The forest seemed different, the trees unfamiliar. I realized I had lost my bearings. I'd been so sure I'd kept track of where I'd come from, but now everything looked the same. I tried not to panic. I had my flashlight and enough daylight left to find my way. I walked in what I thought was the right direction, but the forest seemed endless. The dense trees and underbrush made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, and I couldn't find any landmarks I recognized. As the sun began to set, my unease grew into fear. The forest, which had felt so serene earlier, now seemed menacing. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I'd find my way eventually, but it was no use. I was lost. When darkness fell, I knew I had to stop and wait for morning. Wandering in the dark would only make things worse. I found a spot where the ground was relatively flat and cleared away some leaves to sit down. I had my flashlight and the small snack I'd packed, but the night was cold, and I hadn't brought anything to keep warm. I huddled under my jacket, trying to conserve body heat. The forest at night was alive with sounds. The hooting of owls, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I couldn't see much beyond the beam of my flashlight, and my imagination ran wild. Every sound felt like it was getting closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep much that night. The ground was hard and cold, and every noise startled me awake. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I picked myself up, stiff and sore, and started walking again, hoping to find the cabin. After a couple of hours, I stumbled upon a stream. I remembered crossing a stream on my way into the forest, so I decided to follow it. The water was cold and clear, and I stopped to drink and splash some on my face. It revived me a little, and I pressed on, keeping the stream to my right. Eventually, I found a dirt trail. It wasn't the one I'd taken originally, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead me back to the cabin or at least to a road. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The trail was littered with broken branches and fresh footprints. They weren't mine, and they looked recent. I froze. Someone else was out here. At first, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was another hiker or a ranger who could help me. But as I followed the trail, I started to feel uneasy. The footprints didn't seem random. They circled back on themselves and crossed over each other, as if whoever made them had been wandering aimlessly or deliberately trying to confuse anyone who followed. Then I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A crude wooden structure built against a tree. It was little more than a lean-to made of branches and tarps, but it was clearly occupied. There were empty food cans, a makeshift fire pit, and even a bundle of blankets. Whoever was staying there wasn't far away. I didn't want to stick around to find out who it was. The campsite I'd found the day before flashed through my mind, and I felt a chill. I turned back the way I'd come, walking as quickly and quietly as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to appear behind me. After what felt like hours, I saw something through the trees. The cabin. Relief washed over me, and I broke into a run. When I reached the porch, I collapsed onto the steps, breathing hard. I felt safe again, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the footprints and the lean-to. Who had been out there? Were they still nearby? The forest, which had felt so inviting at first, now seemed like a threat. Every creak of the cabin and every rustle outside made me jump. I kept the flashlight and a kitchen knife by my side, just in case. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my things and loaded them into the car. As I was about to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They hadn't been there the day before, and they weren't mine. I didn't waste any time. I got in the car and drove away as fast as I could, not looking back. As I navigated the winding dirt roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, hidden among the trees. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a sense of relief so profound it almost brought me to tears. I drove straight home, vowing never to go back to that cabin or any other remote place again. The woods might be beautiful, but they're also vast and unforgiving. And sometimes you're not as alone as you think. I always thought of myself as a cautious person, someone who paid attention to details and avoided unnecessary risks. That mindset is what made me think I was prepared when I decided to spend a few days alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't entirely impulsive. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea was to disconnect, reset my mind, and take a break from the stress of my day-to-day life. The cabin belonged to an old acquaintance of mine, Paul. He inherited it from his uncle and rarely used it, so when I asked if I could borrow it for a long weekend, he was more than happy to lend it out. He warned me, though, that it was a bit of a drive and the cabin was very basic. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, some kerosene lamps, and a creek nearby for water. It sounded perfect to me. I was looking for solitude, not luxury. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The main road turned into a gravel path that eventually narrowed into little more than a dirt trail. My car, a reliable old sedan, wasn't exactly built for off-roading, and I found myself gripping the wheel tightly as I navigated potholes and uneven terrain. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. Towering pine trees lined both sides of the path, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and damp soil. When I finally reached the cabin, it was nearly dusk. The structure was smaller than I imagined. A single-story wooden building with a steeply pitched roof and a small porch out front. The paint had long since faded, and the wood looked weathered but solid. It was clear the cabin had been sitting here for years, untouched by modernity. There was a stack of firewood piled neatly by the side of the house and an old outhouse a short distance away. Beyond the cabin, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The first thing I did was unload my supplies. I'd packed light, a sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, a lantern, matches, canned food, and a portable water filter for the creek. Once I had everything inside, I set about making the place livable. The cabin's interior was as rustic as I expected. There was a small cot in one corner, a cast iron wood stove in the center, and a wooden table with 2 chairs by the window. Shelves lined one wall, filled with dusty jars, old tools, and random odds and ends. It was sparse but cozy in its own way. I spent the first evening settling in. I started a fire in the stove to warm the place up, lit a few kerosene lamps, and opened a can of soup for dinner. Outside, the forest was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind passed through the trees. It was exactly what I'd wanted: peace and quiet. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept surprisingly well, considering the cot wasn't exactly comfortable. In the morning, I decided to explore the area. There was a faint trail leading away from the cabin, and I followed it for a while. It wound through the forest, crossing the creek a couple of times and eventually looping back toward the cabin. Along the way, I saw signs of wildlife: deer tracks, a rabbit darting through the underbrush, and even a few bear droppings. It was a reminder that I was truly out in the wilderness. By the second day, I had settled into a routine. I spent the mornings hiking and gathering firewood, the afternoons reading or sketching, and the evenings cooking simple meals and listening to the forest. The solitude was refreshing, but there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't shake. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination and the unfamiliarity of being so isolated. That night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. This was different. It sounded like footsteps, deliberate and heavy, crunching through the underbrush just beyond the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound didn't move away. It circled the cabin slowly, pausing every few steps. I grabbed the hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood and sat there in the dark, listening. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance, and I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. The next morning, I found tracks outside the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. These were human footprints, large and deeply imprinted in the soft soil. They circled the cabin and then disappeared into the forest. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? And why would they be walking around my cabin in the middle of the night? I spent the day feeling jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't see or hear anything unusual, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. That evening, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. Not that it would do much good if someone really wanted to get in. The cabin wasn't exactly a fortress. I kept the hatchet close by and tried to focus on the book I was reading, but every little noise outside made me jump. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. Whoever it was didn't bother to be quiet. They stomped around the cabin, occasionally stopping to knock on the walls. The sound echoed through the small space, sending chills down my spine. I sat in the dark, gripping the hatchet, my mind racing. Should I confront them? Shout? Call for help? But there was no cell service out here, and I had no idea who or what I'd be dealing with. The knocking stopped after what felt like an eternity, and the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as it was light out, I packed my things. I decided I'd had enough of the wilderness and solitude. The plan was to leave as quickly as possible, but when I stepped outside, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A crude figure made of sticks and twine was hanging from the porch, swinging gently in the breeze. It was small, no bigger than a foot tall, but it was unmistakably meant to resemble a person. My stomach churned as I stared at it. This wasn't just some random act of nature. Someone had made this and left it here for me to find. I threw my bag in the car and started the engine. The drive back was a nightmare. The dirt trail seemed narrower than before, the overhanging branches scraping against the car like claws. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. By the time I reached the main road, I was shaking. When I finally got home, I called Paul and told him what had happened. He sounded shocked and promised to look into it, but I could tell he didn't know what to make of it either. To this day, I have no idea who was out there or what they wanted. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin again. What started as a peaceful retreat turned into a nightmare I'll never forget, and the thought of those footsteps circling the cabin still haunts me. When I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin, it wasn't some dramatic search for solitude or an escape from city life. I had work to do, a pile of unfinished reports that needed undisturbed focus. And my friend, Jason, had a cabin he'd offered up countless times. It was nestled deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that you'd have to plan your groceries carefully, but it sounded perfect for what I needed. I arrived on a Monday afternoon, just as the late autumn sun was beginning to set. The road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt path, riddled with potholes and lined with towering pine trees that blocked out most of the light. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin stood there, small and sturdy, with a sloped roof and a narrow porch. It was surrounded by dense woods, the kind that felt like they were watching you back. A single chimney puffed out thin trails of smoke from the wood stove Jason had assured me would keep the place warm. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. There was a main room with a small kitchen, a wooden dining table, and a worn couch facing a cast-iron stove. A short hallway led to the bedroom and a bathroom that was more functional than comfortable. Jason had left it stocked with firewood, bottled water, and basic supplies. I unpacked quickly, setting up my laptop on the dining table and stacking my papers nearby. The sooner I started, the sooner I could finish. The first night was uneventful. I worked until my eyes felt heavy, ate a quick dinner of canned soup, and climbed into the creaky bed. The silence was almost too much at first. No cars, no distant hum of city life, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the hoot of an owl. But I told myself this was what I needed, a chance to disconnect, focus, and maybe even enjoy a bit of nature. By the second day, I had settled into a routine. Mornings were spent writing, afternoons were for stretching my legs with short walks around the cabin, and evenings were for reading or staring into the fire. The isolation wasn't as unsettling as I'd feared. It was actually nice, freeing even. But as the days passed, small things began to gnaw at me. It started with noises. At first, I dismissed them as animals. The woods were full of life, and it wasn't unusual to hear branches snapping or leaves crunching underfoot. But there were moments when the sounds felt deliberate, like the steady thud of footsteps rather than the random scurry of a deer or a raccoon. Once, just after midnight, I thought I heard a low, rhythmic tapping against one of the windows. I'd been reading by the fire and froze, my book halfway to my face. I listened, straining to hear it again, but it stopped. Telling myself it was a loose branch swaying in the wind, I went to bed, though it took hours to fall asleep. On the third day, I decided to explore a bit farther during my afternoon walk. The woods were thick, but there were faint trails leading away from the cabin. I followed one of them, crunching through fallen leaves and stepping over gnarled roots. The air was crisp, and the smell of damp earth filled my lungs. After about 20 minutes, I stumbled across something unexpected, an old, abandoned campsite. There was a rusted fire ring, a tattered tarp tangled in the branches, and what looked like the remains of a tent, now collapsed and overgrown with moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. I couldn't shake the thought of who might have camped here and why they'd left so much behind. Maybe they'd planned to come back and never did. Or maybe something drove them away. I took a few pictures with my phone, thinking I'd show Jason later, and headed back to the cabin. That night, the tapping returned. It was louder this time and unmistakable. I'd closed all the curtains earlier, not wanting to feel exposed in the dark, but now I regretted it. The sound was coming from the window near the kitchen, and my mind raced with possibilities. A bird? A branch? Something else? I stood there, frozen, debating whether to look. Eventually, I grabbed a flashlight and forced myself to pull the curtain aside. The beam of light cut through the glass and into the woods, revealing nothing but trees and darkness. The tapping stopped. By the fourth day, I was on edge. I hadn't slept well, and every creak of the cabin felt amplified. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering. I thought about the campsite, the tapping, the feeling of being watched. Around midday, I decided to take another walk, this time sticking closer to the cabin. I circled the perimeter, scanning the ground for tracks or signs of animals. That's when I noticed something strange. Faint, shoe-like impressions in the dirt. They weren't fresh, but they were definitely human. They led toward the cabin and then disappeared, as if whoever made them had turned back. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing, checking the locks on the doors and windows, and trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe a hiker had wandered through and left the prints. Maybe the noises were just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something felt off. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I built up the fire and double-checked everything. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach and a heavy poker from the stove by my side. The night dragged on, every minute feeling like an hour. Around midnight, the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just at one window. It moved first to the living room, then to the bedroom, then back to the kitchen. Steady, deliberate, like someone testing the boundaries. I stayed rooted to the couch, gripping the poker tightly. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the room. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. By the fifth day, I'd had enough. I packed my things, loaded them into the car, and took one last look at the cabin. The woods felt oppressive, the trees looming over me like silent witnesses. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something watching me go. But there was nothing, just the empty clearing and the cabin, small and unassuming, as if it had never been anything but a quiet retreat. I didn't tell Jason the full story when I returned his keys. I mentioned the noises and the campsite but left out the rest. He laughed it off, saying the woods could play tricks on you when you're alone for too long. Maybe he was right, or maybe some places just weren't meant to be visited alone. Either way, I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be going back. I've always been someone who craved solitude. Growing up in a noisy house with 3 siblings, I learned to appreciate any moment of quiet I could get. That's probably why, after moving to the city for work, I started taking trips out to the countryside whenever I could. These little getaways were my way of recharging, just me and the wilderness. This time, I decided to rent a remote cabin deep in the woods for a week. No internet, no cell service, no distractions, just peace. I found the place on a small vacation rental site. The pictures showed a modest log cabin surrounded by towering pines, with a small lake nearby. It was perfect. The description mentioned it was far from any neighbors and only accessible via a narrow dirt road, but that suited me just fine. I packed my car with enough supplies for a week: food, water, a few books, and my hiking gear, and set off early one Saturday morning. The drive was long but scenic, as the highway gave way to smaller roads and eventually to a bumpy dirt path. I could feel the stress of city life melting away. The cabin came into view after about an hour of navigating that rough road. It looked even better in person, rustic but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a small porch out front. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. After unloading my car, I took a walk around the property to familiarize myself with the area. The cabin sat on a slight hill, with the forest stretching out in every direction. About 200 yards down the slope, I found the lake. The water was calm and clear, reflecting the sky and trees like a mirror. It was so quiet I could hear the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. I stood there for a while, just soaking it all in. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the treetops. I lit the wood stove and cooked a simple dinner. After eating, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink before fading into a deep blue. It was the kind of peace I'd been longing for. The first couple of days passed uneventfully. I spent my mornings hiking through the woods, following faint trails and sometimes just wandering wherever the terrain took me. Afternoons were for reading or napping by the lake. Evenings, I'd cook, then sit by the fire, letting the crackling flames and the chirping of crickets lull me into relaxation. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. On the third day, though, things started to feel off. It began with small things. That morning, while hiking, I came across what looked like an old campsite. There was a fire pit surrounded by blackened rocks, a few rusty cans, and some torn fabric hanging from a branch. It didn't seem like anyone had been there recently, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. Still, I brushed it off. People camp in the woods all the time, I told myself. Nothing strange about that. Later, as I was chopping wood for the stove, I thought I heard footsteps in the forest. Not the soft padding of animals, but the deliberate crunch of boots on leaves. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The sound came again, faint but distinct. I called out, "Hello?" hoping it was just a hiker who'd wandered too close to the cabin. There was no reply, and after a few moments, the footsteps stopped. I stood there for a while, axe in hand, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Eventually, I went back to chopping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the side of the cabin, but when I got up to check, there was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the moonlight. The next day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I told myself it was just to relax, but deep down, I knew I didn't want to wander too far from safety. I spent the morning stacking wood and cleaning up around the cabin. Around noon, I walked down to the lake. As I reached the shore, I noticed something odd. A pile of rocks had been carefully arranged near the water's edge. They weren't there the day before. The arrangement didn't look natural. The stones were too evenly spaced, too deliberately placed. It sent a shiver down my spine. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of who might have done it, but there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing to suggest someone had been there. Feeling uneasy, I kicked the rocks apart and headed back to the cabin. That evening, I decided to lock the doors and windows, something I hadn't bothered with before. Felt silly, after all, I was miles from anyone. But I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been building since the day before. As I sat by the fire, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. The footsteps, the rocks, the feeling of being watched. It was just my imagination running wild in the isolation. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. It sounded like something had hit the side of the cabin. Heart pounding, I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the bed and crept to the window. Shining the light outside, I couldn't see anything unusual. Everything was still. But then I noticed the door to the woodshed swinging open in the wind. I was certain I'd closed it earlier. Summoning my courage, I threw on a jacket and stepped outside. The cold night air bit at my skin as I approached the shed. The flashlight beam danced across the trees, casting long, flickering shadows. When I reached the shed, I found the door hanging off one hinge. Inside, the stack of firewood I'd neatly arranged earlier was scattered across the floor. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt outside the shed, there were footprints. Human footprints. They were larger than mine, and they led off into the woods. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Someone had been here. Someone was out there watching me. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, clutching the axe and jumping at every sound. Sleep was out of the question. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed my things as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The drive back down the dirt road felt like it took forever. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move. Every sound made me flinch. When I finally reached the highway, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It's been a few weeks since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. Maybe it was just some drifter passing through, or maybe it was someone who'd been living in those woods. Either way, I'm not eager to go back and find out. The peace and solitude I'd been searching for came with a price. One I'm not sure I'm willing to pay again. It started with a simple plan. A weekend escape to a cabin deep in the woods. I'd rented it online after seeing pictures of a cozy wooden retreat surrounded by endless trees. The listing promised solitude, fresh air, and a chance to disconnect from everything. Exactly what I needed. My life had been a whirlwind of stress lately. Work deadlines piled up, my phone never stopped buzzing, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd gotten a full night's sleep. The thought of spending a couple of days away from it all sounded perfect. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from the city. The last stretch was on a dirt road that seemed to go on forever, snaking deeper into the forest. The further I drove, the denser the trees became. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight barely broke through the thick canopy overhead. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. The place looked exactly like the pictures. A small, weathered wooden structure with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. There was a fire pit out front, surrounded by a few mismatched chairs, and a stack of firewood neatly piled by the door. The nearest neighbor was miles away, according to the listing. It felt like I'd stepped into another world. Quiet, untouched, and completely isolated. After unloading my bags, I went inside to get settled. The cabin's interior was simple but cozy. A single open room with a bed in one corner, a small kitchen area, and a sitting area by the fireplace. There were a few shelves lined with books and board games, and a rug that looked like it had seen better days. The windows were small, but they offered a view of the forest outside. Everything about the place felt rustic and charming. I spent the first evening unwinding. I cooked a simple dinner, lit a fire in the fireplace, and settled into a worn armchair with a book. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was exactly what I'd hoped for, peaceful and quiet. By the time I crawled into bed, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. But that peaceful feeling didn't last. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't place it. A faint scratching noise, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. My heart raced as I lay there in the dark, straining to hear. The noise came again, soft but deliberate, and I realized it was coming from outside. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray branch scraping against the wood. But the sound didn't stop. I got out of bed and crept to the window, peeking through the curtains. The moon was bright, casting a pale light over the clearing. I couldn't see anything unusual, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Still, the scratching continued, intermittent and persistent. I checked the locks on the door and windows, reassured myself that I was safe, and eventually went back to bed. The sound faded after a while, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I tried to brush off the incident. The sun was shining, and the forest felt inviting in the daylight. I spent the day hiking on a nearby trail, taking in the scenery and enjoying the fresh air. It was exactly what I needed to clear my head. By the time I returned to the cabin, I'd almost forgotten about the scratching. That night, though, it happened again. The same faint, persistent scratching coming from outside the cabin. This time, I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to take a look. Stepping out onto the porch, I shivered as the cold night air hit me. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every little sound seem amplified. I shone the flashlight around the clearing, but there was nothing there. No animals, no branches close enough to the cabin to be causing the noise. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, I noticed something strange. Near the corner of the cabin, where I'd heard the scratching, the ground looked disturbed. The dirt was loose, as if it had been dug up. There were no clear tracks, just an area where the soil looked like it had been recently moved. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe an animal had been digging there? That would explain the noise, I thought. But the disturbed area was larger than what I'd expect from a small animal. As the day went on, my unease grew. I couldn't stop thinking about the scratching, the disturbed ground, and the strange quietness of the forest. Even the sunlight didn't feel comforting anymore. I started to notice how isolated I truly was. If something happened out here, no one would know. No one would hear me. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent than before. I lay in bed, heart pounding, as the sound moved along the wall of the cabin. It wasn't just one spot anymore. It seemed to circle the cabin, as if something was deliberately moving around the perimeter. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and my phone and stepped outside. The air was freezing, and the forest seemed darker than ever. I shone the flashlight around, my breath visible in the cold night air. For a moment, everything was still. Then, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing. The beam of my flashlight caught movement. A figure, barely visible, slipping into the shadows of the trees. Panic surged through me. I shouted, but the figure didn't respond. They were gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. My hands shook as I backed toward the cabin, locking the door behind me. I tried calling for help, but my phone had no signal. I was completely alone. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. I sat by the fire, clutching a kitchen knife, listening for any sign of movement outside. The scratching didn't return, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure I'd seen. Who were they? What were they doing out here? And why had they been near the cabin? By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed my things in record time, constantly glancing over my shoulder as I loaded the car. The forest felt oppressive, the trees closing in around me. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief. The tension in my chest eased, and I realized how tightly I'd been gripping the steering wheel. I drove straight home, vowing never to go back to that cabin again. Later, I tried to find out more about the area. I searched online, looking for any reports of strange activity near the cabin, but I didn't find anything. The listing was still up, with glowing reviews from other visitors. No one else seemed to have experienced what I did. To this day, I don't know who or what was outside the cabin that night. Maybe it was just a trespasser, someone passing through the woods. Or maybe it was something more sinister. Whatever the case, I learned one thing. Solitude isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's downright terrifying. The cabin stood in the heart of a dense forest, its wooden walls weathered by years of exposure to the elements. It wasn't a place I had chosen willingly. I had inherited it from my late uncle, a man I barely knew. I had driven up to Vermont to inspect the property, thinking it would be a quick visit. Maybe I could sell it off to someone who loved solitude, but I never imagined how isolated it would feel once I was there. The drive to the cabin had been uneventful. Miles of winding roads had given way to a single dirt track, bordered by tall pines that seemed to close in as I went deeper into the woods. By the time I arrived, the late afternoon sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional caw of a crow. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. The cabin itself was modest, with a sloping roof and a small porch that sagged slightly. A rusted axe leaned against a chopping block by the side, and a stack of firewood was piled neatly under a tarp. The windows were grimy, and the front door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and old wood. The furniture was sparse. A small table with 2 chairs, a threadbare couch, and a cast-iron stove in the corner. A single bedroom lay at the back, its narrow bed covered with a faded quilt. I dropped my bag by the door and walked through the cabin, checking for any signs of animals or damage. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I noticed a few cobwebs in the corners. The place felt untouched, as though my uncle had walked out one day and never returned. A few personal items remained: a pair of boots by the door, a jacket hanging on a hook, and a mug on the table. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite put into words. After unpacking a few essentials, I decided to explore the surrounding area before nightfall. The forest was dense, with towering trees that blocked out much of the evening light. A narrow trail led away from the cabin, winding through the undergrowth. I followed it for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. There was no sign of other people, no distant hum of cars or voices. It was just me and the wilderness. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped. I lit a fire in the stove, its warmth filling the small space. I cooked a simple meal on a portable camping stove I had brought with me and ate in silence, the crackling of the fire my only companion. Outside, the darkness was absolute, the kind that only exists far from city lights. I tried to read a book I'd packed but found it hard to concentrate. My mind kept wandering back to the eerie silence of the forest. When I finally went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin creaked and groaned as it settled, and every noise seemed amplified in the quiet. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I got up to look through the window, there was nothing but darkness. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and followed the trail from the previous evening. It led deeper into the woods, winding through thick undergrowth and over small streams. After an hour or so, I came across a clearing with an old, dilapidated shack. It looked even older than the cabin, with its roof caved in and walls covered in moss. Curious, I approached it cautiously, peering through the broken windows. Inside, I saw remnants of furniture, a rusted stove, and a pile of rotting wood. It didn't look like anyone had been there in decades. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the ground near the shack. It was a set of footprints, fresh and unmistakable. They weren't mine. They were larger and pressed deeply into the soft earth. My heart began to race as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. The forest around me was silent, too silent. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, so I hurried back to the cabin, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and sat by the window, watching the trail for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I tried to convince myself that the footprints belonged to a hunter or a hiker, but the nagging feeling of unease wouldn't go away. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every noise. The next day, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed my things and loaded them into the car, eager to leave the cabin behind. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood, but nothing seemed obviously wrong. I wasn't much of a mechanic, and with no cell service, I couldn't call for help. Frustrated, I decided to walk to the nearest town, which was about 10 miles away according to the map. I started down the dirt road, the forest pressing in on either side. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. After a few miles, I noticed something strange. The road, which had been clear earlier, was now littered with branches and debris as though a storm had passed through. I hadn't heard any wind or rain, and the sky was clear. It didn't make sense. As I continued, I began to feel like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the sensation, and every so often, I would stop and turn around, only to find the road empty. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every step, the trees casting long shadows across the path. My pace quickened, driven by a growing sense of urgency. When I finally reached the town, I was exhausted and on edge. I found a small gas station with a payphone and called for a tow truck. While I waited, I told the clerk about the strange occurrences, but he just shrugged and said the woods could be eerie sometimes. "People get spooked out there," he said, as if that explained everything. The tow truck driver arrived an hour later and drove me back to the cabin. He looked around uneasily as we approached. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered under his breath. He managed to get my car started, and I didn't waste any time leaving. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. But there was nothing. It's been weeks since that trip, and I can't get the experience out of my mind. The cabin is still in my name, but I have no intention of going back. Whatever was out there, whether it was a person or just my imagination, I don't want to find out. The woods have their secrets, and some are better left undisturbed. I've always enjoyed the quiet. Growing up in a city full of noise and chaos, the idea of escaping to a secluded cabin in the woods felt like heaven. It was something I'd been planning for years. A week of solitude. No phone, no internet, just me and nature. When I finally found the perfect spot, a small, one-bedroom cabin nestled in a dense forest miles away from the nearest town, I booked it without hesitation. The drive to the cabin was peaceful, the kind of scenic route that forces you to slow down and appreciate the world around you. The last stretch was a dirt road, winding through towering trees that formed a canopy overhead. The cabin appeared at the end of the path, a rustic structure with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. It looked exactly like the pictures online. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and stepped inside. The interior was cozy, with wooden walls and a stone fireplace. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a couch and a coffee table, and a bedroom in the back. The windows were large, letting in plenty of natural light during the day. It was perfect. I unpacked my things, stocked the fridge with the groceries I'd brought, and set up my gear. I'd brought a notebook to jot down thoughts, a few books to read, and a camera to capture the beauty of the forest. This was going to be my week to disconnect and recharge. The first day was uneventful. I spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin. There was a small creek nearby, and the sound of running water was soothing. I hiked for a couple of hours, following trails that seemed rarely used. The forest was dense, with trees so tall that their tops disappeared into the sky. The air was crisp and clean, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was exactly what I needed. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. I made myself a simple dinner and sat on the porch, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. The stillness was almost eerie, but in a comforting way. As night fell, the forest became pitch black, the kind of darkness you don't experience in the city. I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire. The second day started much like the first. I woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch to watch the sunrise. The forest seemed to come alive in the morning light, with animals scurrying about and birds singing. I decided to explore a bit further that day, venturing deeper into the woods. I'd marked my path with small ribbons tied to branches, a trick I'd learned from a hiking guide. It was easy to lose your sense of direction in a place like this. About an hour into my hike, I came across something strange. It was a clearing with a large tree in the center, its trunk scarred with deep grooves. The ground around it was covered in disturbed earth, as if something had been digging. It felt out of place, almost unnatural. I'm not a superstitious person, but there was something about that tree that made me uneasy. I took a few pictures and moved on, not wanting to linger. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. The forest is full of strange sights and sounds, and not everything has an explanation. Still, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, faint rustling and the occasional snap of a twig. Every time I got up to look, there was nothing there. The darkness seemed to press in on the cabin, and I found myself constantly glancing at the windows. The third day was when things started to feel truly off. I decided to check out the clearing again, curious to see if I'd missed anything. When I got there, the disturbed earth looked fresher, as if someone had been digging there recently. The grooves in the tree trunk seemed deeper, almost as if they'd been carved further. It made no sense. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived, and the cabin was miles from the nearest road. Who would come out here and why? As I stood there, the forest felt unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I'd planned to hike further that day, but the unease was too much. I turned back, following the ribbons I'd tied to guide me. Halfway back to the cabin, I noticed one of the ribbons was missing. At first, I thought I'd simply missed it, but as I kept walking, I realized several were gone. Someone had removed them. By the time I reached the cabin, I was on edge. I locked the doors and windows, something I hadn't bothered to do before. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, constantly checking outside and listening for sounds. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I heard what sounded like footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I stayed up all night, clutching the fireplace poker, my eyes glued to the door. When morning finally came, I decided to leave. The cabin had lost its charm, and I no longer felt safe. I packed my things quickly and loaded them into the car. As I was about to start the engine, I noticed something on the porch. It was one of the ribbons I tied during my hike, neatly folded and placed on the steps. My blood ran cold. Someone had been there watching me. The drive back to civilization was nerve-wracking. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by people and noise. I never reported what happened. What would I say? That someone had removed some ribbons and left one on my porch? It sounded ridiculous, but I knew what I'd experienced. To this day, I can't explain what happened during those 3 days at the cabin. I've tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just some prankster or a fellow hiker. But the look of that clearing, the missing ribbons, the footsteps, it all felt deliberate, targeted. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I've given up on the idea of a secluded getaway. The quiet that I once craved now feels suffocating, filled with unseen eyes and unheard whispers. Some places I've realized are better left alone. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization. It was the kind of place I had always imagined escaping to when life in the city became too much. This wasn't my first solo retreat, but it was the first time I had gone so far off the grid. I needed this, a complete break from noise, emails, and the hum of urban life. I arrived late in the afternoon. The gravel road leading up to the cabin had been rough, and my small car struggled to make the climb. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a sense of relief. It was modest but sturdy, made of dark wood that blended almost seamlessly into the forest surrounding it. A small porch wrapped around the front, and there was a single rocking chair sitting there, as if waiting for me. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. I stood for a moment, taking it all in. The cabin felt secluded, almost too secluded, but that was the point.
No distractions.
Just me, the woods, and a pile of books I had been meaning to read. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The interior was just as rustic as the outside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture looked like it had been there for decades. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old gas stove and a single sink. There was a faint smell of wood smoke and something faintly metallic, like rust. After unpacking my things, I decided to explore the area around the cabin before it got dark. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out. The forest was dense, with towering trees that blocked out most of the evening light. The path leading away from the cabin was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and moss. I followed it for a while, stepping over fallen branches and ducking under low-hanging limbs. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped lower in the sky. About half a mile from the cabin, I found a small clearing. In the center was a fire pit surrounded by rocks. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on why, but standing there gave me a sense of unease. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned back toward the cabin, deciding it was better to return before it got completely dark. By the time I made it back, the forest was shrouded in shadow. I locked the door behind me and set about making dinner. The cabin's electricity came from a small generator, and I didn't want to waste it, so I cooked on the gas stove by the light of a single lantern. The quiet was almost oppressive. I hadn't realized how accustomed I was to the constant background noise of city life. After eating, I settled into the armchair by the fireplace with a book. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I tried to focus on my reading, but my mind kept drifting back to the clearing I had found. There was something unnatural about it. I shook off the thought, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The first night passed uneventfully, though I slept fitfully. I woke up several times, startled by the sound of branches tapping against the windows. Each time, I reminded myself that I was alone out here. There was nothing to be afraid of. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I packed a small backpack with water and snacks, then set off down the same path I had taken the evening before. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing but still heavy with an unexplainable tension. I walked for hours, taking in the sights and sounds of the woods. Birds chirped overhead, and I spotted a few squirrels darting through the underbrush. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail branching off the main path. Curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. The trail was narrow and difficult to navigate, but it eventually led me to an abandoned cabin. This one was much smaller than mine, and it was in a state of disrepair. The roof had partially collapsed, and the wooden walls were covered in moss and ivy. I stepped closer, peering through a broken window. Inside, I could see the remains of a table and a few chairs, all covered in a thick layer of dust. There were old cans and bottles scattered across the floor, as if whoever had lived here had left in a hurry. The same sense of unease I had felt in the clearing washed over me. I decided not to linger and made my way back to my cabin. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I sat by the fireplace, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I locked the door and windows before going to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the forest. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of something knocking on the front door. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The knocking came again. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the door. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no response. I shone the flashlight through the window, but I couldn't see anything. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping a kitchen knife and jumping at every sound. The following morning, I found nothing outside the cabin to explain the knocking. No footprints, no signs of animals. I decided to cut my trip short. The isolation, which had initially seemed so appealing, now felt suffocating. I packed up my things and loaded them into the car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent and still, framed by the dense forest. I told myself I'd never come back, but a part of me wondered if I would ever truly leave it behind. The woods had a way of staying with you, creeping into your thoughts and dreams, long after you'd gone. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a break from the constant noise of the city. Just me, some food, and a small cabin deep in the woods. I needed peace, and this cabin, far from everything and everyone, seemed like the perfect place to find it. I had rented it online. The description was simple: secluded cabin, ideal for reflection, surrounded by nature. I didn't expect much, just a tiny wooden structure in the middle of nowhere. When I pulled up to the place, I was a little surprised. It was much smaller than I thought. The cabin was old, the wood faded, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. But it had a certain charm, the kind of rustic charm you see in those offbeat places people go to get away from everything. I grabbed my bag from the trunk of my car, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The air smelled damp, a little musty, but not unpleasant. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved inside. It was a simple cabin with a small kitchen area, a single bedroom with a double bed, and a tiny bathroom. There was a stone fireplace on one wall, with a few logs stacked beside it. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen any visitors for months, maybe even years. I unpacked my things, hung up my jacket, and set my phone on the kitchen counter. No signal. Perfect, just the way I wanted it. I didn't need distractions. The woods outside were dense, the kind of forest that seemed to go on forever. Tall, thick trees with gnarled roots twisting out of the ground, and the occasional rustling sound that kept you on edge. But I figured I'd get used to it. The first night went by without incident. I lit the fireplace, roasted some marshmallows, and sat by the window, watching the shadows shift in the trees as night fell. It was quiet, almost eerily so. The kind of silence that seemed to press down on you, making you acutely aware of every little sound. At one point, I heard something scratching at the door. I froze, listening. It was faint, like claws dragging along the wood. I stood up slowly, heart pounding. I opened the door and stepped outside, but there was nothing. Just the cool night air and the empty woods. I shrugged it off, figuring it was some animal, maybe a raccoon or something. I went back inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. Sleep came easily, and for a while I didn't even think about the strange noise. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sun filtered through the gaps in the curtains, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch, taking in the fresh morning air. The forest seemed alive, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, but as the day wore on, things started to feel off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I went for a walk in the woods, hoping the exercise would clear my mind. The trees towered over me, their branches intertwining above, blocking out much of the light. The ground was soft and damp, covered in layers of fallen leaves. As I walked, I kept hearing the occasional snap of twigs, as though someone or something was following me. I stopped, look around, and nothing, just the trees. But the feeling didn't go away. I had this overwhelming sense that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But when I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it when I left. I stepped inside cautiously, checking every room, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, that uneasy feeling lingered. I spent the evening by the fire again, trying to relax, but every so often, I'd hear something outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. At one point, I saw a figure moving between the trees in the distance, a shadow just out of reach of the cabin's lights. I squinted, but it was gone before I could focus on it. I told myself it was an animal or maybe just my imagination running wild. But something didn't sit right. That night, I slept fitfully, tossing and turning. The wind picked up, and I could hear it howling outside, rattling the windows and causing the trees to sway more violently. I woke up to the sound of scratching again, this time louder and closer. My heart raced. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound stopped suddenly, and for a long moment, I didn't hear anything at all. Then, a soft thud on the door. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the door, scanning the area outside. Nothing. The forest was silent again, but I knew something was off. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and pushed the furniture in front of it, just in case. The next morning, I was determined to leave. The unease had grown too strong. As I packed my things, I noticed more strange details. Footprints in the mud around the cabin, but they weren't animal tracks. They looked like human footprints, bare feet, but they were faint, as if someone had been walking in and out of the cabin without leaving much of a trace. I was about to get in my car and leave when I noticed something near the edge of the woods, something shiny reflecting in the sunlight. I walked over, curiosity getting the better of me. It was a small, old-fashioned pocket watch, the kind you might see in a movie. It was dusty, like it had been buried in the ground for years. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and froze. The back was scratched up, but there was one clear engraving on it. My name. I stood there, my heart racing. How could this be? I hadn't seen this watch before, and yet there it was, in the middle of nowhere with my name on it. I was done. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want any part of it. I drove off, not looking back, not stopping until I was miles away. When I got home, I immediately checked my bags, hoping I hadn't just imagined it all. But sure enough, the pocket watch was still in my coat pocket. I don't know what happened in that cabin or who, if anyone, had been there with me, but I don't think I'll ever truly know. The only thing I know for sure is that I'll never go back. And I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, of hearing things I couldn't explain, and of seeing something I didn't understand. But as I sit here, writing this, I can't shake the feeling that maybe I haven't seen the last of that cabin. Because sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear the sound of scratching at my door. I wasn't sure what possessed me to book a weekend getaway alone in a remote cabin, tucked deep in the woods. Maybe I needed a break from the constant noise of city life or the stress that had been piling on me. My friends thought it was a bad idea, saying things like, "Aren't you scared?" Or, "What if something happens to you?" But I was determined. It was going to be a quiet, peaceful escape, just me and the forest. The drive to the cabin took hours, the winding roads narrowing as I left the town behind, and I could feel the isolation settle in. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the woods. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, a little worn but with a charm that made it look like something out of a dream. It had a woodsy, weathered look, like it had been there for decades. I stepped out of my car, feeling the cool air hit me, the scent of pine trees mixed with the dampness of the earth. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the cabin door. The keys were hidden in a lockbox, just like the owner had told me. I grabbed the key and let myself inside. The place was exactly as it was described, simple, rustic. There was a stone fireplace in the center of the room, a small kitchen off to one side, and a loft above with a queen-size bed. Everything was in its place, a little dusty but otherwise cozy. The walls were adorned with old, faded pictures, the kind you find in thrift stores. It wasn't luxurious, but that was exactly what I was looking for. Peace, quiet, and a break from the world. I unpacked my things, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the fire. As the flames flickered, I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. The wind outside howled, and the trees creaked with the pressure, but I was warm inside. I felt safe. The night passed without incident. I spent it reading, thinking, and enjoying the solitude. But as the fire died down, I noticed something strange. It was a soft noise at first, barely perceptible. A thump, like something or someone was walking around outside. I shrugged it off. It was probably an animal. The woods were full of creatures, after all. But then it came again, louder this time. A scraping sound against the side of the cabin. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the blackness. There was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe an animal was scratching at the wood. The noises stopped for a while, and I convinced myself to go to bed. It was just a random sound, nothing to worry about. The next morning, I woke to find the sun shining brightly through the window. The whole cabin was bathed in golden light. For a moment, everything felt normal again. I got dressed, made breakfast, and sat at the table, enjoying the view of the forest. But as I looked out the window, I noticed something odd. There were marks in the dirt right outside the cabin. Scratches like something had been dragged along the ground. My heart began to race. I stepped outside, walking cautiously to inspect the marks. They led toward the back of the cabin, and I followed them, trying not to panic. At the back of the cabin, near the edge of the woods, I found something that made my stomach turn. There was a section of the cabin's wooden wall that looked off. The boards were cracked, and one had been torn away, leaving a jagged hole. It wasn't big, but it was enough to let someone or something slip inside. I felt a rush of cold fear flood my chest. The noises last night, the scraping, What if someone had been trying to get in? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a weathered spot in the cabin structure, something natural. But something about the hole didn't feel right. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. I was alone in the woods, miles from anyone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one here anymore. I spent the rest of the day checking the windows and the door every few minutes, but I didn't see anything. Still, the unease gnawed at me, and every time the wind howled or a branch snapped, I jumped. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had come here for peace, not to feel like I was being watched. That evening, as darkness crept back into the forest, I sat by the fire again, hoping to find some comfort in the warmth. I tried to distract myself, pulling out my phone to check the weather forecast. The screen flashed for a second, then went blank. I checked the battery, it was full. I tried turning it back on, but it stayed dead. Weird, I thought. Maybe I dropped it too hard earlier, or maybe it was a glitch. But as I put the phone down, I noticed something strange. A small rock lay in front of the fireplace, right in the center of the room. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. The cabin's floor wasn't clean enough to have missed it earlier, and it wasn't something I would have overlooked. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My first instinct was to pick it up and throw it out, but I paused. The room felt too still, too quiet. I couldn't explain why, but I had the distinct feeling that something, or someone, had been inside while I wasn't paying attention. I couldn't sit still anymore. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. I grabbed my jacket and went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. But as soon as I stepped out the door, I froze. The air was unnaturally still, and the woods seemed unervingly silent. Not a single bird, not even a rustle of leaves. I turned around slowly, my gaze landing on the trees behind the cabin, and that's when I saw it. There was a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its form almost blending with the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest, and I instinctively took a step back. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. I didn't know if it was human or some kind of animal, but the feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. I backed away from the edge of the cabin, stepping back inside and slamming the door shut behind me. I locked every window and door and sat in the dark, my back pressed against the wall. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the silence returned. The woods outside seemed to come alive again with the sounds of wind and distant creatures. I sat in the dim glow of the fire, too terrified to sleep, too restless to move. In the morning, I packed up my things. The cabin, with its eerie stillness, felt like a trap, and I didn't want to stay another minute. I didn't bother checking the windows or the door. I just wanted to leave. I grabbed my keys, and with shaking hands, I started the car. As I drove away, I glanced at the cabin one last time in the rearview mirror. The place looked untouched, almost peaceful in the morning light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't, that there was something out there, something that wasn't meant to be found. I didn't know what had happened there. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the isolation had gotten to me. But as I left the woods behind, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. I had always wanted to escape the noise of the city for a while, a brief break to recharge. So when I found a small cabin nestled deep in the woods, I knew it was the perfect spot for me. The listing described it as isolated, a small getaway surrounded by trees, with no one around for miles. The perfect place to disconnect from everything. I booked it without hesitation. The drive up was long, the kind of winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. As the city slowly faded into the rearview mirror, the surroundings began to shift. The buildings gave way to forests, the trees growing taller and thicker, closing in around me. There was something calming about it, the slow hum of the engine and the sound of my tires crunching on the gravel roads. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. When I finally reached the cabin, it felt like I had stepped into another world. The place was exactly as described: small, quaint, and surrounded by towering pines. There was a porch with a couple of old chairs, and the air smelled of damp wood and earth. The cabin itself was made of logs, weathered by time, with a stone chimney puffing out a thin wisp of smoke. I unloaded my stuff and stepped inside. It was cozy, simple furniture, an old wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen with everything I'd need for a few days. There was a fireplace on the far wall, and a large window that gave a perfect view of the woods beyond. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over everything. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the light fade. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The kind of quiet where you could hear the faint rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, but nothing else. It was a little unsettling at first, but I chalked it up to being in a new place. The first night went by without incident. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book, and went to bed early. The bed was comfortable, and I quickly fell asleep, the quietness outside wrapping around me like a blanket. But around 3 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a shift in the air, like something had changed. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening. I could hear the wind picking up outside, the trees creaking with it. Then I heard it. The faint tapping sound came from the window. I froze, unsure if I had heard it correctly. The wind could cause strange noises, I reasoned. Maybe it was just a branch tapping against the glass. But then it came again, this time louder.
Top, top, top.
I felt my heart skip a beat. I slowly got out of bed and crept to the window. The faint glow of the moon lit up the forest outside, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, swaying gently in the wind. No one around. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The tapping had stopped. I went back to bed, trying to shake the unease from my mind. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on me. But sleep didn't come easily after that. Every little sound seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind howling through the trees. It felt like the woods were watching me. I finally drifted off, but the rest of the night was fitful. The next day, I decided to go for a hike. I figured some fresh air would do me good and help clear my mind. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and set off into the woods, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The forest was thick, and the further I went, the quieter it became. There was no wildlife, no birds singing, no animals rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I walked for hours, enjoying the solitude. The path eventually began to narrow, and I found myself in a part of the woods I hadn't seen before. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting in odd angles. The air felt cooler here, the sunlight dimming as the canopy thickened. I looked around, realizing I had no idea where I was anymore. The trail had disappeared, swallowed by the dense woods. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed different now. The trees looked unfamiliar, the shadows longer, darker. My heart started to race as I realized I was lost. I hadn't seen a trail marker in ages. The quietness of the woods felt oppressive now, like something was wrong. I kept walking, hoping I'd find my way back, but every direction seemed the same. The trees stretched out endlessly in all directions. I was starting to panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think. I couldn't afford to get lost completely. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted a clearing. I rushed toward it, desperate for some sign of civilization. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the underbrush thick with ferns and moss. And then I saw it. A broken fence, rusted and decaying. Beyond it was the remains of an old cabin. Its roof caved in, its windows shattered. It was an abandoned cabin, just like the one I had rented, except this one had been left to rot. The sight sent a chill down my spine. I approached cautiously, stepping over the fence and into the overgrown yard. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls of the cabin were falling apart, and the wooden beams groaned under the weight of time. I walked around the back of the cabin, my mind racing. There was no way I was imagining it. This had to be part of the same property. I had to be near the cabin I was staying in. But something didn't feel right. The place felt wrong, like something had happened here, something that wasn't supposed to be remembered. I turned to leave but stopped. There was a small shed behind the cabin, half hidden by the overgrown vines. Something about it called to me. I walked over and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dark, but I could make out the shape of a wooden crate in the corner. I approached it, my curiosity getting the better of me. The crate was old, the wood brittle. I pried it open, my hands trembling. Inside, there were clothes dirty, torn, and stained. But there was something else. A small journal. I picked it up, feeling a strange weight in my chest. It was old, the pages yellowed and crumbling. I flipped it open, the words barely legible. It was a diary, written by someone who had stayed here long before me. The entries were erratic, full of fear and desperation. The person spoke of strange noises in the woods, of things watching them at night, of feeling trapped in the cabin, unable to leave. They wrote about hearing footsteps outside, but when they checked, no one was there. And then one entry stopped mid-sentence, leaving only a smear of ink. I quickly slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. This wasn't just some old cabin. It was a place that had seen something terrible. I needed to get out of there. I ran back to the main cabin as fast as I could, my legs aching, my mind racing. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting long, twisted shadows. I stumbled back onto the familiar trail, relief flooding through me when I saw the cabin in the distance. When I returned to the cabin, I locked all the doors and windows, not caring how silly it seemed. The silence outside was deafening, and the thought of spending another night there was unbearable. I didn't know what had happened in those woods, what had happened to the person who had written that journal, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I packed my bags and left, not even bothering to take a second look at the place. The drive back to the city felt like a rush of freedom. The roads that had seemed so eerie the day before now felt like a lifeline. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, safe and sound. The woods were beautiful, but they held secrets. Secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. And as much as I wanted to forget about that abandoned cabin and the strange diary, I knew I would never forget the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in a place that didn't want me there. It wasn't just a cabin in the woods. It was a warning. It had been years since I'd gone camping. Life had gotten in the way, work, responsibilities, all the things that kept me chained to routine. But one weekend, I decided enough was enough. I wanted to get away from it all, just for a bit. No phone, no obligations, just me, nature, and silence. I found a cabin in the middle of nowhere, on the outskirts of a national forest. It was an old, rustic place, one that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a single flashlight. The reviews were sparse, but the ones that were there talked about its peacefulness and isolation. Perfect, I thought. I needed to be alone, and I wanted to disconnect. The drive there was longer than I anticipated. The forest was thick with trees that stretched as far as the eye could see, casting long shadows even though it was still early afternoon. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and a little damp, felt good to be out of the city, away from the noise and the chaos. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. It looked exactly as advertised, wooden, aged, and tucked into a small clearing. There was a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs and a wooden path leading into the forest. I grabbed my backpack, which was full of camping gear, food, and some books. The cabin had a single room with a loft, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. Basic, but I didn't need anything more. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I immediately felt the chill of the air inside. The place smelled musty, like old wood and dust, but I didn't mind. I closed the door behind me and began to unpack. Felt good to settle in. I started a fire in the stove, making sure to get it going well before the night fully set in. The night came fast, and with it, an eerie quiet. No animals, no wind rustling the trees, just an unnatural stillness. I didn't think much of it. It was the forest, after all. It was supposed to be quiet. I ate a quick dinner, some canned beans and a granola bar, and settled into the rocking chair by the fire. I had a book with me, but the flickering flames and the shadows on the walls kept pulling my attention away. I tried to read, but it was hard to focus. My eyes kept wandering to the dark corners of the cabin, to the long shadows outside the windows. Every so often, I'd hear a creak or a groan from the walls, but I attributed it to the old wood settling. It was normal for a cabin like this, right? But then, around midnight, I heard something that wasn't normal. A knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like someone tapping on the cabin door. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen anyone on the drive-in. There was no one around for miles. I stood up, slowly, unsure of what to do. The knock came again, this time more urgent. I wasn't sure if I should open the door or just pretend I didn't hear it. The last thing I wanted was for someone to show up out here in the middle of nowhere. I approached the door cautiously, peeking through the small window beside it. There was no one there, just the dark expanse of the forest. My breath released in a shaky exhale. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, a branch or something. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. I backed away from the door and went back to the fireplace, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I figured it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation of the cabin. But the sound of the knocking wouldn't leave my thoughts. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing strange noises. The occasional tap against the door, followed by a scratching sound, like something was trying to claw its way in. I gripped the edge of the blanket tighter, my pulse racing. I knew it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. By morning, I was exhausted. The night had felt endless, and the knocking had stopped only when the first light of dawn peeked through the trees. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I figured I'd take a quick walk around, clear my head. I needed to get out of the cabin and remind myself that nothing was wrong. I stepped outside, and the crisp air hit me, grounding me a bit. The forest was beautiful in the morning light. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the ground. It was quiet, too quiet that I walked down the path a little ways, keeping close to the cabin. The forest around me felt dense, thick with trees that blocked out most of the sky. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing, just trees, rocks, and the occasional bird. I wandered for a while, lost in thought, until I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones. They were large and looked like they had been made by boots. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen anyone come by. The only way these prints could have appeared was if someone had been following me. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get back to the cabin and lock the door. But I didn't want to appear panicked. I didn't want to make a rash decision and make things worse. So, I turned around slowly, walked back down the path, and entered the cabin. The cabin felt colder than before. I checked the windows, making sure they were all locked. The door was secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to make a plan. I could stay inside, keep an eye on things, and wait for the sun to set. Or I could pack up and leave, get out of there while I still could. I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger, but the thought of someone lurking around outside, someone who knew I was alone, made my skin crawl. The thought of going back to the car and driving away seemed more appealing every second. I sat by the fire for a long time, thinking. When night came again, I was more on edge than ever. The knocking started again, just like before. Only this time it was louder, more insistent. The door rattled as if something was pressing against it, trying to get in. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it through the cracks in the door, but I saw nothing. No figure standing in the dark. No sign of anyone outside. But the knocking didn't stop. It was like someone was trying to break the door down. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow. I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't just sit there and wait for something to happen. I had to take control. I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with essentials. Food, water, a flashlight, and my phone. Even though there was no service out here, I wasn't sure where I would go, but I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. The knocking continued, louder now, as if it was shaking the walls. I opened the back door quietly, careful not to make a sound. The cold air hit me immediately, but I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the woods. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back, not caring where I was going. The trees rushed past me, the sounds of the cabin fading behind me. I didn't stop until I found a small creek, and I knelt by it, gasping for air, my heart still racing. I realized then that I had no idea what had been knocking on the cabin door. Was it someone playing a prank? Or was it something more sinister? I couldn't answer that. But what I did know was that I wasn't going back. Not there, not ever again. I stayed by the creek for hours, just listening to the sounds of the forest. Eventually, I made my way back to my car, my nerves still shot. When I finally drove away from the cabin, I didn't look back. I didn't want to. There was no need to. I made it back to the nearest town before dark, my mind still reeling from the experience. I don't know what was going on at that cabin. I don't know who or what was knocking on the door, but I do know this. I'm never going camping alone again. The woods were too quiet, the cabin too isolated. I thought I was looking for peace, but what I found instead was something I wasn't ready to understand. I'm just glad I made it out of there in one piece, and I haven't thought about that cabin since. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear that knocking in my mind, and it still scares me. I had never been one to shy away from the wilderness. In fact, I welcomed the solitude and peace that came with the isolation of the forest. It was the perfect escape, away from the hustle of daily life, from the constant noise, from the nagging distractions that seemed to follow me everywhere. The cabin I rented for the weekend was the ideal spot for some much-needed alone time, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was small but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, wooden floors, and thick log walls that gave it a cozy, rustic feel. I arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the landscape. The air was crisp, and the wind carried with it the earthy scent of pine. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, unpaved, and bordered by dense trees. It took a while to get there, but the isolation felt almost reassuring. There would be no one around for miles, just me, the forest, and the quiet. The cabin was in better shape than I expected. Well-maintained, sturdy, and even had a small porch with a couple of chairs. After unloading my stuff, I grabbed a beer from the cooler and sat down to enjoy the evening. Watching the sky slowly turn dark, the night crept in quickly, and soon the only light came from the flickering orange of the fireplace inside the cabin. The night was peaceful at first, with only the occasional rustle of leaves outside, perhaps a squirrel or a deer moving through the underbrush. The air inside was warm from the fire, and I felt at ease. I cooked myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just some pasta and salad. The sounds of the forest were distant but present, like the low hum of the world beyond. But after a while, I began to notice something off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a creeping sensation, like someone was watching me. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation, to the stillness of the night. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, but there was something else, an unnatural stillness between the gusts, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone in a remote cabin. Of course, I'd be more aware of every sound, every movement. But then I heard it, footsteps, faint but distinct. They weren't from the forest. They came from just outside the cabin. I froze. My heart began to race. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a bear, moving through the area. But the sensation of being watched didn't go away. I spent the rest of the night on edge, unable to fully relax. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees, made my heart skip a beat. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I locked the doors, bolted the windows, and pulled the blankets up around my shoulders. I tried to sleep, but the sense of unease kept me awake. The footsteps, the silence between the wind's gusts, the way the forest seemed to have gone still. It all weighed on me. The next morning, I woke up groggy and tired. The sun had already risen, casting a pale light through the cabin windows. The air outside was chilly, but the day promised to be clear. I made some coffee and sat on the porch, trying to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. The forest looked peaceful again, bathed in soft sunlight. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the leaves above. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, enjoying the quiet beauty of the forest. The trees were tall and dense, the ground soft with moss and pine needles. I didn't see anyone else the entire day, which only added to the feeling of isolation. But despite the beauty, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. That night, I made sure to double-check the locks and the windows before bed. I didn't want to take any chances. As I lay in bed, the night seemed unnaturally quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just the sound of my own breathing. It was as though the forest had completely shut down, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were closer, more deliberate. They weren't from the forest. They came from just outside the cabin again. I could hear the crunch of the gravel on the ground, the soft tap of boots against the porch. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it had to be an animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and carefully crept toward the window. I peeked through the blinds, scanning the porch. First, I saw nothing. The moonlight cast long shadows, but the porch was empty. I breathed a sigh of relief, but just as I turned away from the window, I heard the unmistakable sound of the cabin door handle turning. I froze. The door was locked. I was sure of it, but the handle turned again, and then there was a faint scraping sound, as if someone was trying to force the door open. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. There was no one else out here. I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone and called the only number I could think of, the local sheriff. But the call didn't go through. There was no signal. I was cut off. The scraping stopped. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart. I dared not move. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. I stayed as still as possible, listening for any sound. Minutes passed, and then I heard the footsteps again, retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of the wind made me jump. At dawn, I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't taking any more chances. I threw my things into the car as quickly as I could, looking over my shoulder the entire time. The forest was still and silent. There were no signs of anyone around. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been near the cabin. But something about the way the trees stood, tall and dark, felt different. They felt watchful. As I pulled away from the cabin and headed back down the rough road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was small in the distance, barely visible among the trees. But for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the window. A shadow, perhaps, or maybe just my imagination. But that feeling, the one that had lingered with me all weekend, didn't go away. It stayed with me long after I left the woods, long after I was back in the bustle of everyday life. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. It's been months since I left, and I've never been back, and maybe I never will. The night I arrived at the cabin, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the forest around the cabin looked like something out of a postcard. A small, isolated cabin, tucked deep in the woods, far away from the bustling noise of the city. Just what I needed after weeks of feeling overwhelmed with work and personal life. The drive up had been long, but it was worth it. The forest was thick, the kind of place you could get lost in easily if you weren't careful. The gravel driveway leading to the cabin was narrow, and there were no other houses in sight. Just trees, and more trees. It was as peaceful as it was remote. I parked my car in front of the cabin and took a deep breath, feeling the cool mountain air fill my lungs. I was ready for some quiet. No phone signal, no internet. Just me and the wilderness. I grabbed my bag, got out of the car, and locked it behind me. The cabin had a rustic charm. Wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a porch that stretched out along the front. There was an old rocking chair on the porch, which creaked slightly as I approached it. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. The door creaked open as I pushed it, and inside was exactly what I expected. Wooden beams, an old-fashioned wood-burning stove in the corner, and a small kitchen area. It smelled faintly of pine and something earthy, like the forest itself had somehow seeped inside. The floors creaked underfoot as I set my things down and took in the surroundings. It was cozy. A small sofa, a wooden table, and a few chairs scattered around the room. Nothing fancy, just functional. A fireplace on the far wall caught my attention, and I could already imagine myself curling up in front of it later, reading a book or just listening to the crackling of the fire. I didn't waste much time unpacking. I was eager to get settled and make a fire. It wasn't cold yet, but I knew it would get chilly as the night wore on. The firewood was neatly stacked next to the stove, ready for use. The matches were in the kitchen, and I quickly got to work. As I crouched in front of the stove, arranging the wood just right, I noticed something strange. A small, faded piece of paper was wedged behind one of the logs. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. The paper was old, brittle at the edges, and yellowed with age. Written in dark ink were a few words: "Don't go outside at night." I stared at the words for a long moment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a strange feeling. I wasn't one to be easily spooked, but something about those words, written so simply, unsettled me. Maybe it was just an old warning, left behind by someone who had stayed here before. Maybe it didn't mean anything at all. I shook my head and tucked the note into my bag, deciding to not let it bother me. The fire crackled to life soon after, and I sat back, feeling the warmth spread through the room. The flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that was both peaceful and comforting. I grabbed a book from my bag and settled into the armchair. Time seemed to slow down in that cabin, like the outside world didn't exist. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside as a breeze moved through the trees. I must have lost track of time because before I knew it, night had fully set in. I glanced outside through the window, and all I could see was darkness. The kind of darkness that seems to stretch on forever, with no moon or stars to break it up. It felt like the forest had swallowed the cabin whole. I stood up and stretched, thinking about calling it a night. The bed was inviting, and I was already feeling the pull of sleep. As I walked toward the bedroom, something caught my attention. The rocking chair on the porch, the one I had seen earlier, was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, back and forth. I paused, my heart rate quickening. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, but then I realized that the wind wasn't strong enough to move a chair like that. The motion was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was sitting in it, rocking gently. I shook my head again, trying to dismiss the thought. It was probably just the wind after all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned away from the window, heading back to the fire to take a moment to calm myself. I didn't want to let my imagination get the best of me, but there was something about that movement that didn't sit right. I closed the curtains and sat back down by the fire. The room felt warmer now, and the fire's crackle was comforting. I tried to focus on the book in my lap, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even inside the cabin. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up with a start. The cabin was still dark, and the fire had long since burned out. I could hear the sound of the wind outside, howling through the trees. It wasn't just a gentle breeze anymore. The wind had picked up, and it sounded like it was whipping around the cabin, rattling the windows. I sat up, my heart racing. The feeling of being watched had returned, but this time it was stronger. There was something outside, something I couldn't see but could feel. The darkness outside seemed to press in against the cabin, as though the trees themselves were closing in. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for morning. But there was something in the air, something that made me feel like I had to get out. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to go. Maybe it was the note, maybe it was the way the chair moved, or maybe it was just the strange, oppressive feeling that had settled over me. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold, biting at my skin. The wind whipped around me, and I could hear the trees groaning, bending under the pressure of the storm. I looked around, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. The forest was silent now, almost too silent. The kind of silence that made you feel like you were no longer welcome. I walked to the edge of the porch, my eyes scanning the dark forest. Every tree, every shadow seemed to hold something. A movement caught my eye, something small and fast darting between the trees. I froze. It was a figure, just a flash of motion, too quick to make out clearly, but it was there. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was just imagining things, but the feeling, that sense of being watched, wouldn't leave. The cabin, the forest, everything seemed to close in on me. I had to get away. I turned to go back inside when I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible over the wind. Tapping. I froze again, listening. Came from behind me, from the woods. Slow, deliberate tapping, like something or someone was knocking on a tree. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, trying to shake off the panic that was rising. There was nothing there, just the dark woods stretching out endlessly before me. But that sound, that tapping, it was still in my ears, even though I couldn't hear it anymore. I ran inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it. The cabin felt suffocating now, like it was no longer a refuge but a prison. I tried to calm myself, tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. But I knew something was wrong. The night passed slowly. I didn't sleep. Every noise outside made me jump. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. By morning, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. When the sun finally rose, the world outside looked different. The forest was still, silent in the early light. The storm had passed, and the air felt fresh again. But the cabin felt different too. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something had changed. I left that morning, not looking back as I drove away. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Even as I drove down the narrow gravel road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. The cabin was a memory now, a strange, unsettling memory. I don't know what happened that night or why I felt so uneasy, but I do know one thing: I'm never going back. I'd always loved the idea of escaping to a cabin in the woods. Something about being surrounded by nothing but trees, the scent of pine, and the silence that blankets everything. It felt like the perfect way to recharge. I had seen pictures of these remote cabins, small and cozy, tucked away in corners of nature where no one would bother you. No cell service.
No distractions.
Just me and the wilderness. It wasn't an easy decision to make. My friends had been encouraging me to take a trip for weeks, urging me to disconnect for a bit. After a year of chaotic work schedules and constant emails, I finally gave in and booked the cabin. I found a small one up in the hills, about 2 hours outside the city. It looked perfect, nothing too fancy, but the kind of place where you could truly get away. The owner had left a note online, saying it was secluded, no neighbors for miles. I thought that sounded ideal. I packed my car, loaded up with enough food for a week, and set out for the cabin early on a Friday morning. The drive was peaceful at first. I passed familiar suburbs, then gradually, the roads became more narrow and winding. The trees grew denser, the sky gray with the promise of rain. I followed a series of signs and dirt roads that twisted and turned. I'd been driving for over an hour when I began to question whether I had made the right decision. The road, barely wide enough for one car, seemed to shrink the further I went. Eventually, I saw the cabin. It was nestled into a clearing, its wooden walls blending with the surrounding forest. The rain had started to fall heavier by then, but it didn't bother me. The sound of raindrops against the trees was calming, like the woods themselves were breathing. I pulled up to the cabin and parked my car beside the porch. The place had an old charm to it, with a steep roof and a small front porch. There was a rusted swing chair on the porch, which creaked in the wind. I stepped out, grabbed my bags, and walked up the steps. The door was unlocked, just as the owner had promised. I pushed it open, and the smell of wood and dust filled the air. The cabin was exactly as I'd hoped. Rustic, but comfortable. The living room had a stone fireplace, a couple of armchairs, and a big, worn couch. The floors creaked under my feet as I walked through the space, checking out the small kitchen and bathroom. It was a small, modest place, but it would be perfect for a week alone. I unpacked my things, threw my jacket over the back of a chair, and settled down on the couch, feeling the tension of the city start to fade away. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple dinner, watched the fire crackle in the hearth, and read a book for a bit. As the evening wore on, the wind picked up, howling through the trees outside. The cabin groaned with the pressure of the storm, but it wasn't anything to worry about, just nature doing its thing. The second day started with a thick fog that rolled through the woods. I made some coffee, stepped outside to enjoy the cool morning air, and took in the view of the surrounding forest. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet where you feel like you're the only one left in the world. I decided to go for a hike. The weather had cleared up, but the air was still damp from the rain. I followed a trail that started just beyond the cabin. The path was narrow, winding between trees. It wasn't long before the only sounds I could hear were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After an hour of walking, I stopped for a break. I found a fallen log, sat down, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, and the forest around me felt alive. I felt completely alone, but in a good way. For the first time in a long while, I could hear myself think. But then, a sound broke through the stillness. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting branches, but it was too deliberate. A crunching sound, like footsteps, far off in the distance. I froze, listening intently. The woods were dense, so it was hard to tell exactly where the sound had come from. I glanced around, but there was no movement, nothing that would suggest someone was out here with me. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. But as I stood up to continue my hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the sound. It was the sense of being watched, like someone or something was following me. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the unease lingered. I made my way back to the cabin, the feeling of being followed growing with every step. When I reached the clearing near the cabin, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The sense of unease faded a little, but it still clung to me like an unwanted shadow. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself. I made lunch, watched the fire burn down, and even played a game of solitaire. The daylight hours passed in a slow, comfortable haze, but the creeping feeling of being watched never fully left me. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I decided to stay inside for the night. I locked all the windows and doors, drew the curtains, and settled in for a quiet evening. But the next morning, I woke up to something that would change everything. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest that greeted me. It was a soft scratching noise coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or some other animal, but then it happened again. Soft, deliberate, and consistent. I lay still in bed, listening. The scratching was at the door. I sat up, heart racing. I was alone, no one should be out there. The owner had mentioned that the cabin was isolated. There were no other houses for miles. But still, that scratching, it was unmistakable. I forced myself to get out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and moved quietly toward the door. The scratching stopped as I approached. I hesitated for a moment, then peered out the window. Nothing, just trees. The mist from the morning fog hung thick in the air, and the world outside was still and silent. I checked the door. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Someone had been watching. The rest of the day passed without incident. But that night, as I sat in front of the fire, I noticed something odd. The front porch light flickered, then went out completely. I hadn't touched it, and I hadn't heard the usual hum of the electric system failing. It was as though something had just turned it off. I waited for a few moments, expecting the light to come back on, but it didn't. At that point, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched anymore. The sounds, the strange occurrences, it was all building up. I checked every window and door again. Everything was locked, but the unease didn't leave. The wind picked up again, and the rain started to fall harder, tapping against the roof like 1,000 tiny fingers. I curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with the book, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Was someone out there? Had I just imagined everything? Or was there something or someone lurking in the woods, watching, waiting? I stayed awake most of the night, listening to every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every drop of rain. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. The next morning, I decided to leave. Something in me had changed overnight. I couldn't explain it, but I just felt like it wasn't safe anymore. I packed up my things in a hurry, grabbed my keys, and left the cabin behind. The drive back home was a blur. I didn't stop, didn't look back. As I passed the winding roads, the trees closing in on me, I realized that some places, no matter how peaceful they look, hold secrets that are better left uncovered. And maybe, just maybe, it was better I never found out what was really lurking in the woods. I had always wanted to take a break from the bustle of everyday life, to escape to a cabin in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees, quiet, and my own thoughts. A friend of mine told me about a secluded cabin up in the mountains, far from the nearest town, a place to be truly alone. I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to recharge, take some time off, and explore the outdoors. Little did I know that this cabin would become the place where I would face something I never expected: fear. I arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon. The weather was cool but comfortable, with the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, with a small dirt road leading to it. The trees around it were tall and thick, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was exactly what I had imagined: a small wooden cabin with a rustic feel. The windows were big enough to let in light, but small enough to make the place feel cozy. A small porch wrapped around the front of the cabin, with a few rocking chairs placed along it. The setting was perfect, and I felt a wave of calm wash over me. I unpacked my things and made myself at home, settling into the small but comfortable living room. The cabin was old, but not in a bad way. It had that weathered charm, the kind that comes with age and use. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, the walls were lined with wooden beams, and there was an old stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The smell of pine and fresh air filled the cabin, and I couldn't help but smile to myself. I was alone, and that was exactly how I wanted it. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. After a quick dinner, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I grabbed my jacket, tied my boots, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me like silent giants. The ground was soft beneath my feet, covered in layers of fallen leaves and pine needles. I walked for a while, following a narrow path that wound its way deeper into the woods. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of the leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. I kept walking until the path began to disappear, swallowed up by the thick undergrowth. At that point, I decided to turn back and head toward the cabin. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air seemed heavier, the silence more profound. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, a subtle tension in the air that made me uneasy. I hurried my pace, eager to get back to the safety of the cabin. When I finally returned, it was almost dark. I locked the door behind me, ensuring all the windows were closed. I didn't know why I felt so uneasy, but I tried to brush it off. I started a fire in the fireplace, hoping the warmth and light would ease my mind. The fire crackled and popped, filling the cabin with a comforting glow. I settled onto the couch, watching the flames dance in the hearth, trying to relax. But the unsettling feeling lingered. I kept hearing faint noises, cracking, rustling, coming from outside, as if something was moving through the woods. But every time I glanced out the window, the darkness outside was still, the trees standing motionless against the night sky. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound seemed to make me jump, every creak of the floorboards or snap of a twig outside sending my heart racing. But I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the woods. After all, I was alone, and nothing was out there. Or so I told myself. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds singing outside. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light through the windows. I stretched and yawned, grateful for the daylight, as if the sun had somehow dispelled the lingering unease from the night before. I decided to head out again, this time with the goal of hiking up to the top of the nearby hill for a better view of the surrounding area. The climb was challenging, but not unbearable. The trail was steep in some places, but the air was fresh, and I could smell the earth beneath my boots as I made my way up. After a while, I reached the top. From there, I could see for miles the vast expanse of the forest stretching out in every direction. It was beautiful, serene, and peaceful. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the night before. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the distance, there was something moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it didn't move like one. It was too deliberate, too human in its pace. The shape was indistinct, hidden among the trees, but I could make out the silhouette of a figure moving in the direction of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was someone else out here? How had they found this cabin? I quickly descended the hill, my breath coming in short gasps as I hurried back toward the cabin. The thought of someone else being out here so far from civilization made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I arrived back at the cabin, I immediately checked the windows and doors. Everything seemed secure, but the unsettling feeling was back, stronger than ever. I decided to wait inside, not daring to venture out again. I couldn't shake the thought of that figure moving through the woods, and the longer I sat in the cabin, the more I felt like I was being watched. As night fell, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The wind howled through the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig echoed through the air. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just my imagination running wild. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I stayed up late that night, keeping a watchful eye on the windows, my nerves on edge. Every crackling sound from the woods sent me into a state of alert. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A tapping, like fingers on glass. I bolted upright, my heart racing. I didn't dare move for a moment, straining to listen. The sound came again, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from outside the cabin. I slowly crept to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The tapping stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. The woods were quiet once again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there, something I couldn't explain. That I spent the rest of the day inside, not daring to go out. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to pack up and leave just yet. Something about the cabin, the place, the isolation had a hold on me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I needed to stay just a little longer. By evening, the tapping had stopped. The strange presence outside seemed to fade, and the peace of the forest returned. I finally allowed myself to relax, and the tension that had been building in my chest began to ease. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I made myself a hot meal, settled by the fire, and forced myself to enjoy the moment of calm. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in days. The unease, the fear, it had all faded away, replaced by the warmth of the fire and the quiet comfort of the cabin. The next morning, I packed up and left, making my way back down the trail toward the town. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The place that had felt so isolating, so strange, now seemed peaceful in the morning light. I still couldn't explain the things I had experienced there, the noises, the figure in the woods, but I was sure of one thing: I wouldn't be returning anytime soon. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching me, I had no intention of finding out. The road back to town was quiet, and the sun shone brightly overhead. I felt lighter, more at ease as I left the woods behind. I didn't know what had really happened at the cabin, but I knew that I had faced something that had made me realize just how vulnerable I could be out there, in the middle of nowhere. And that was enough for me. I had always wanted to escape to the mountains, to find a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach me, where I could just breathe and let go of everything. That's why, when I found this secluded cabin tucked away in a dense forest, I thought it was the perfect getaway. The pictures online looked peaceful, and the owner had assured me it was isolated enough that I wouldn't have to worry about anyone disturbing me. The drive was long and winding. It took me through narrow roads flanked by towering trees that blocked out the sun. It wasn't exactly a comfortable ride, but I didn't mind it. I welcomed the isolation, the quiet. The further I drove, the more I felt like I was getting away from the chaos of my everyday life. The cabin finally came into view just as the sun was setting. It sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees and a creek that ran through the woods. It looked even more isolated than the pictures had shown, which only made me more excited. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace. I pulled up to the front of the cabin and unloaded my things, taking in the crisp mountain air as I did so. The front door creaked as I opened it, revealing a simple but cozy interior. The smell of aged wood and fresh pine filled my lungs. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a small kitchen area, and a loft with a bed. The windows were large, giving a perfect view of the forest that stretched out into the distance. I decided to make myself a cup of coffee before unpacking. As I sat at the small kitchen table, I could hear nothing but the sound of the creek outside and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Felt perfect. But as night started to fall, things began to feel different. The quiet was heavier, more suffocating. The wind picked up, and the trees outside began to creak and groan. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the normal sounds of the woods. Still, I felt a strange sense of unease creeping in. I spent the next hour settling in, making the cabin feel more like home. I unpacked my clothes, stacked some firewood near the fireplace, and lit a fire to warm up the space. The flames flickered and crackled, casting shadows on the walls. I sat by the fire, sipping my coffee, trying to enjoy the peace I had come here for. But there was something in the back of my mind that wouldn't let me relax. It was like I was being watched, even though I knew I was alone. It was then that I heard it, a soft scratching noise from the back of the cabin, coming from the side door. It was so faint at first that I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time. I froze, listening intently. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something was dragging against the wood. I stood up and moved toward the back door, my heart starting to race. The wind was still howling outside, and the trees were swaying, but the scratching noise didn't stop. I reached for the door handle and pulled it open cautiously. There was nothing there, just the dark woods stretching out into the distance. I breathed a sigh of relief and started to close the door when I noticed something on the ground. A small pile of dirt, like something had been digging or scratching at the earth. I knelt down, studying it. The soil was disturbed, and it didn't look like it had been there long. I could feel my nerves starting to fray. I shut the door and locked it, double-checking the other windows and doors. Everything seemed secure, but the uneasy feeling remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, even though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I spent the next few hours in the cabin, trying to distract myself. I read a book by the fire, made dinner, and even went outside for a walk around the perimeter of the cabin. But no matter how much I tried to calm myself, I couldn't get rid of the tension building in my chest. As the night wore on, I decided to go to bed early. I climbed into the loft, pulling the covers up to my chin, hoping sleep would ease my nerves. The fire below crackled and popped, but soon I heard nothing but the sound of my own breathing. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. The scratching. This time it was louder, closer. My eyes snapped open, and my heart began to race. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The sound was coming from the side of the cabin again, but it was different this time. It was more frantic, like whatever was out there was trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept down the stairs, my bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The light from the flashlight trembled in my hand as I approached the door. I shone it through the window, but there was nothing there. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees. I could see the branches swaying violently, casting strange shadows on the walls of the cabin. I took a deep breath and opened the door. There was nothing in the yard, no sign of any animals or people. But as I scanned the darkness, something caught my eye. A faint trail in the dirt, leading into the woods. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. Something had been moving out there, and it hadn't been an animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, too spaced out. I stood there for a long moment, weighing my options. The logical thing would have been to stay inside and lock the door, but the fear gnawing at my insides told me that whatever was out there wasn't going to leave me alone. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and decided to follow the trail. The woods were thick, and the ground was uneven, but I pressed on, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The further I walked, the more the trail seemed to wind and twist, leading me deeper into the forest. It felt like hours before I finally stopped. The trail led me to a small clearing, where the ground was soft and wet. The moonlight shone through the trees, revealing something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old, weathered shack. It wasn't much bigger than the cabin, but it looked abandoned. The wood was rotting and the windows were broken, but the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I stood there for a long time, staring at the shack. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't turn back. The trail had led me here for a reason, and I had to know what that reason was. I approached the shack slowly, the door creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. I moved cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the room, and then I saw it, a pile of clothes in the corner, covered in dirt and leaves. But as I stepped closer, I realized they weren't just clothes. They were rags, torn and stained with something that looked like blood. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled backward, the light from my flashlight flickering. I had to get out of here, fast. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I froze. The scratching sound was back, louder than ever. It was coming from behind me, from within the shack. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. The room was empty, except for the pile of rags. But the scratching kept getting louder, more frantic, as if whatever was inside was trying to break free. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted out of the shack, not daring to look back. I ran through the woods, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I stumbled over roots and rocks. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. But I was safe. Whatever it was, it wasn't out there anymore. I sat in the corner of the cabin, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But the woods were silent again. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the steady creaking of the cabin. I knew I had to leave in the morning. I couldn't stay here anymore. But for now, I just needed to calm down, to breathe. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, hoping I could sleep. But I knew deep down that I would never forget the terror I had felt that night. The scratching, the abandoned shack, and the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. I left the cabin the next morning, and I never came back. The woods were too quiet, too suffocating, and I knew I would never be able to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I never found out who or what had been living in the shack, or what had been scratching at my door. But one thing was certain: I wouldn't be returning to that place again. I had escaped, and I intended to keep it that way.